joining us to answer questions in the chat. So feel free to put those questions or comments in there as we go. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. And I apologize for the garbage truck in the background.
Great, thank you, Jessica. No apologies necessary. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk, Collaborating with Undergraduate Instructors in Student Learning. And we're going to be discussing a research project we've been engaged in throughout the past year at the University of Pittsburgh to understand more about teaching in the undergraduate classroom and how we in the university library system might influence it. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm happy to have this chance to introduce you to our research project team. Diana, Claire, and I are your presenters today. And we thank you, Jessica, for giving us that nice introduction. So we're also joined in our presentation by Jeanann Haas, and she was the lead librarian on our research project, and Veronica Webster, who's the director of assessment for the university library system. And she provided us a lot of guidance in all things methodology and IRB related throughout our project. So we're really happy that our whole project team could be here, and we're honored to be presenting today. So I just wanted to take this moment to explain who we all are, so that when you hear that our research project is focused specifically on instruction with primary sources, you'll see from the composition of our team that we are from a lot of different departments and kind of come to this initiative with different professional backgrounds in academic libraries and both expert and novice views on special collections. So we're not all archivists or curators of special collections, but we each kind of come to this with our own interest in the educational role of libraries and a desire to better understand teaching and learning at our institution so that we might design, deliver, and assess instructional programs that are high impact and that contribute to student success at all levels and across all disciplines. So we've kind of tried to make a concerted effort for this presentation to create something for all of you that would be of interest to you from whatever type or size of library that you're coming from and from whatever position. So we'll go to the next slide. So for our talk today, I'm going to give an overview of the research project we've all been collaborating on this year. And then Diana will talk about the research methods and data analysis. And then Claire will share some of the insights from our findings before we open it up for a dialogue with all of you. And we're really hopeful that some of the lessons we've learned and the discoveries we've made as part of this collaborative experience will be relevant for all of you and potentially translatable to your own local context. Of course, we welcome your questions throughout if you want to pop them in the chat, but we're thinking, at the end is when we'll really start to address those questions. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit about our project. So in spring 2019, we responded to a call for the ITHAKA S+R Teaching with Primary Sources project. Approximately 20 institutions from the US and UK were invited to participate. ITHAKA S+R is the research arm of ITHAKA that brings us JSTOR, ArtStore, and other research resources that we all know and love. They regularly partner with academic institutions and libraries to conduct action-oriented research that is intended to advance inquiry and guide decision-making. They typically run a multi-institutional study each year, so you might have seen their reports come out on all kinds of various different topics. So if you're ever interested in participating something like this, just watch for those calls on their website or through your favorite listserv. In order to participate, institutions do make a contribution, not only in the time devoted to the project by members of the team, but also a financial contribution from the library or institution. So just to kind of talk you through, like, initially the goal of the study that we joined was to better understand how libraries can best support undergraduate classroom learning with primary sources. And using qualitative methods, we interviewed faculty from across multiple disciplines in the humanities and social sciences to understand why they teach students the research process and how primary sources are an integral part of those learning experiences. So all of us on the project team devoted time over the past year on the training sessions that ITHAKA provided for us, as well as conducting those interviews with faculty and gathering and analyzing data. And I will say that participating in an association-sponsored study comes with some perks that make the whole thing a bit more manageable, because, you know, you're doing your job, living your life, and then also participating in this pretty intensive research endeavor. So ITHAKA provided training for us. They would keep us going with deadlines and reminders. So we always felt like we were on track with our timelines. They even developed the instrument that we use to conduct our interviews, which was all really great. So it's, I mean, it seems like, well, that's all so perfect, right? But the way I think about it is participating in something like this is like opting into a meal delivery service. All the ingredients are there and they tell you exactly what to do to get the desired results, but you still have to do all the work. And you have to make it into something that has your own spin on it. So some of the kind of prepackaged aspects that we found particularly helpful included an analysis of stakeholders early on that really helped us think through like who we wanted to engage with throughout the project, both internally and externally to our organization. Some of the structured learning experiences that we all went through and things like that were really helpful. So. The next step in our process will be the writing of the report on our local findings. Diana's going to be talking more about the data gathering and analysis and in the next section, so I'll let her speak on that. But for now, I'd like to provide you with what we see, broadly speaking, as kind of the impact and benefits and opportunity that we hope will come from our work on this project. So I think we can go to the next slide. So when you launch into something like this, the goals are always and probably should be pretty broad and lofty. So our hope initially was to understand the practices of instructors who use primary sources to teach undergraduates in the humanities and social sciences. We wanted to be able to answer questions like, what's the value of integrating primary sources into classroom learning? How do teaching faculty think library materials and expertise fit into that? And from our participation in this study, we expected to inform new approaches for our instructional program and to create opportunities for professional development for ourselves and for our colleagues in conducting research studies like this one. So our results reveal the challenges and barriers sometimes, and even examples of successful engagement that we've had with faculty and instructors. And Claire will be talking more about those in her section of this talk. So to kind of wrap up this part, I would just say that like everything we do in libraries, we're in a continual iterative process of examining how we do things, really learning what's the impact of our work and our engagement with our partners on campus and how we influence, especially in the case of this project, student learning. And then to really, based on what we find and what we learn, to adjust our approaches accordingly. So this project was a great chance for reflection and learning for all of us, and especially to gather some of that local evidence that we could use to inform our practice and make decisions. So I'll turn it over to Diana now to give you kind of a peek into that evidence.
Okay, Carrie gave you a good overview of the project, so now I'm going to give you some details on how we actually gathered the data and coded it. And as Carrie mentioned, Claire will give you more information on what the results of that, an observation of the data will give us. Because the study covered institutions across the US and external, like England and Canada, ITHAKA provided structured questions which we all use. So we all had to stick to the questions that ITHAKA gave us. ITHAKA also, as Carrie mentioned, provided training and guidance on the project, and they instituted a schedule that kept us on track. So we knew what we had to do and when we had to do it. The training that ITHAKA provided, though, was really very interesting, and I think that's something that would be useful to all people who may be not as research savvy. They covered topics like how to ask interview questions, how to do your coding, the basic mechanics of the process, so you didn't feel that you were left out in the cold. There was somebody there who was giving you that training and that support. For this particular study, ITHAKA wanted to look specifically at instructors who use primary sources in undergraduate teaching with humanities and social sciences. So we had to look only at that particular group. And they defined what the use of primary sources meant to them. And that was that the instructors had to use the actual objects that were historical or contemporary artifacts. So they couldn't use something like Tom Sawyer in Penguin Edition. It was to look at the actual first object that came from that endeavor. The primary sources could be held by the library, or they could be something that the instructor got from other sources. That could be their own curation. They could have gotten it from another institution, or they could have found these resources online. There was no restriction that the resources had to come from our own collection. In addition, the instructors that we mentioned, that we interviewed, didn't necessarily have to even engage with archives and special collections. When we identified the instructors that we would want to engage with in this study, we looked at the people who had come to archives and special collections because we knew something about what they taught. But we also asked our fellow colleagues, liaison librarians, the archive and special collection associates. So we asked around to see if there were others who were working with people in our institution who may be using primary sources or who had classes that might center around these areas. In addition, we also looked through the course catalog to see if we can identify courses that mention primary sources, because we wanted to get a greater feel for people who not only used our resources, but who didn't use our resources, so we would have a greater understanding of how those resources were used. I'm sorry about that, backwards. So in trying to identify all these faculty, we've managed to find 63 who were using primary sources to some degree in their classes. ITHAKA said they wanted an interview of 12 to 15, and that's because they were looking at interviews from multiple institutions, so they wanted to limit the pool of people who were being interviewed. Of the 63, we managed to narrow it down to 27 faculty who seemed to closer fit the project guidelines of undergraduate primary sources used in a particular way and in humanities and social sciences. With that 27, we had to do some pre-interviews to confirm that their instruction actually fell within the guidelines, that they were looking at primary sources the way that we were specified. And if they did fall in those guidelines, we asked them if they were interested, and if they were, we scheduled an interview. So of the 27, we were able to schedule 14 one-hour interviews, which we recorded between September and November of 2019. Unfortunately, one of the interviews had recording issues, so we weren't unable to use it. That means we had 13 transcribed that we were able to look at and evaluate. The way we did the interviews, we went in with a digital recorder, we recorded the interview, and then we used a transcription service to provide the text of that interview. So we didn't sit there and type it out. We sent it to someone we paid to have them do the transcription. When we got notification that the transcription was completed by the service, we read through them. So each person who performed the interview, me, Claire, Jeanann, and Carrie, we would get an email back saying your person's transcription is ready, and we would then go listen to the interview and read the transcription and make sure that everything was actually okay. Once we did that, we then exported it to Word. Finally, we gathered up all 13 interviews and we anonymized them and we sent them on to ITHAKA, because ITHAKA is going to be doing that national, international type report, the greater report about this project, while we're only going to be looking at our Pitt interviews for our local report. After we finished looking at the transcriptions, ITHAKA had a refresher training session on coding, because they knew that was a concept that a lot of people had issues with, potentially because they hadn't coded. And since we talked about it months before the coding was actually due, it was a good opportunity to go over things that we may have forgotten about or needed some more clarification on. So we could use a coding software like NVivo to help us with the process, but one of the things that we considered is that we didn't all have experience with using that. I think Carrie and Veronica were the only two who had experience using it. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't add a learning curve onto the arduous work of actually going through these interviews and coding them. So we decided to stay with Word and then use Excel to help us look at the fine details. And I'll show you what that process looks like. So this is an example of the Word document that we had. What we did is we read through the document. We used the review process to add comments in and to highlight things. So you can see here in this document, the first section is highlighted and it's marked as assignments. So the way we came up with those tags, we met initially as a group. And since we had all sat through the interviews, obviously, and we've read through the transcripts, we had an idea of what sort of topics people were discussing, the interviewees were discussing in the interviews. So we came up with a first list of terms that we could potentially use, like assignments that you see here in curation and challenges, because we thought those were topics that definitely rose to the surface. We went through the first 30 minutes of Pittsburgh 1, which was the very first interview, and we applied those codes. Then we met again as a group and we said, so how did that actually look? Did that make sense? Did those terms make sense? We decided that we needed to do some further tweaking. We did that. We applied those tweaks to the first 5 interviews, met again, discussed the codes, if we were using them, how we were using them, and made our final tweaks to the codes themselves to apply to the 6th through 13 interview. And this is sort of like what we came up with. This is our code list, the terms that we had, and we had some descriptions of them and how we were going to use them. And that was just basically to give us some guidelines as we were going through these Word documents and applying the codes. Once we applied the codes, we had these Word documents. And as you can imagine, if you wanted to see all the information about primary source format, it's going to be really difficult to go through Claire's Word document of 13 interviews, my Word document, and Jeanann's, to see where primary source format showed up. So we used Excel to help us with that. And what we did is we created an Excel file. In the file, each of us had a tab. So I had a tab, and on my tab, I had a row for each of the interviewees, and then the columns were the subjects or the code words that we were looking for, the language that we were designating that we were looking for. So things like assignments, experience in teaching, primary source context, primary source format teaching, those sorts of things that we have looked at and coded and tagged in the Word documents. So you have your row, you have your columns, then you go back through that respondent. So for example, if this were respondent 1, and I'm not sure which respondent it is actually, whenever I would see primary source format in that document as a comment, I would take the timestamp for the area of the text that I wanted to call out, put that in the cell, then add the text that was actually defined with that tag, and then I would put a semicolon. And I would add to that cell everything that for that respondent was primary source format tagged. And as I said, in each Excel sheet, we had rows of respondents with columns of the tags themselves. Once we finished that, we then moved on to getting this information out. So if you wanted to look just at primary source format, you didn't want to have to go through this screen, as you can see, because it's kind of difficult. So what we did is we used text to columns in Excel, and I created a second Excel file. And in that second Excel file, we had a sheet for each of the codes, and then we split out for each of the respondents what was in that cell. So you'll see in this example, there's Clare 6. So Clare 6, if this were assignments, that row would have all the times that the interviewee 6 mentioned assignments. And then Clare 7, that would be the 7th interviewee every time they mentioned assignments. So we had this so we could then split that out and go and look at each of the sheets and find out, get a greater understanding of what was being talked about with assignments or primary source format or things like that. So that was the process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Claire because she'll be able to give us more details on what we actually saw.
Okay. You can hear me, right? Just checking.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So on to major findings and implications. So you've just heard there was, a lot of work there, and we did this because we really wanted to be able to better understand what else was needed to support instructors, what was present, what was missing, what worked, what didn't, what their perspective or take was on a variety of issues to see what could be improved upon. Right now, we're just at the beginning of the process of analyzing the data. We're working on that local report. So consider these preliminary, these findings. And it's well worth noting that there are many topics that we want to take a closer look at. There are many things that are interrelated, that there are different facets of. There are lots of ways that we're going to be able to slice and dice this information. But most immediately, there are 3 areas that we identified as significant to explore. So I'll outline a bit about what we heard, some ideas on next steps to take, and I guess we'll just start with the first one, teaching, but specifically training. Teaching was, of course, dominant throughout this, but really there were just many ways to break the topic down into a number of categories, or again, these facets of teaching. But by far the most surprising finding, and a significant one we really think, was that very, very, very few had any type of formal training involved in using primary sources in teaching. So here's a direct quote: "I don't think I received any formal training." The pool of participants that we ended up with, you've heard a bit about that, but I don't know that we told you yet that it was a range of graduate students and new faculty to established and long tenured instructors. So they were also from a broad range of institutions. So we thought this was very interesting information. One of us in an interview, what we heard was, "I learned just by throwing spaghetti against the wall, doing it and seeing what worked." That I think it's pretty clear that it's wide open. Some of them did mention that there was a class they took, and interestingly, a lot of times this was at graduate level, or else maybe they mentioned that there was a mentor. And but in all of these cases that they cited, though, it wasn't as if it was formal training. right? It was more, oh, I really like this, and this seemed to me to be a good example of what I could do. Another person told us, my own engagement in archives has been my entry point and how to imagine teaching undergraduates. So there was this correlation then to what they learned that they thought was really, really valuable. So they understood that the exposure for undergrads would be a really good thing to facilitate learning. And then one person just flat out said, I don't have any formal instructional resources that I use, nor have I created them. It's something I've adapted over the years. They went on to say, that is something that I think would be really wonderful, a kind of guide for working with primary sources for students. So there was our invitation right there. It's wide open. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right. So we have some ideas of what to do for next steps. We really do want to create some guidance, and we're considering, should it be workshops, training modules, templates, ways to share examples, and then who would this be with? Would it be new faculty? Would it be grad students, established faculty? We also know that collaboration is something that was commented on in a lot of different ways in the data and in these interviews. So partnering, maybe within the ULS. I'm a liaison myself in addition to being part of special collections, and we know there are also functional specialists. Their university has a Center for Teaching and Learning. So these are all potential people to join us as we look at this area that we think is really valuable. And then we all know that online learning, because of COVID-19, is what we're looking at for fall. So maybe there are opportunities within that framework to launch something. I mean, we're going to have to jump in anyway, and we're doing that, but this informs perhaps what we might do. Okay, the next slide, curation. So think of curation broadly, a gathering or scoping of content. You know, it's what we do as librarians all the time, and it's certainly what we do when we have classes come in. We found that sometimes there was a preference for digital, especially because of accessibility, and sometimes there was an ambivalence about that because it wasn't seen as the best way, but it was certainly the easiest way to get students in contact. Sometimes they cited unique or optimal content online. We're not all going to have the papers of Emily Dickinson, for instance. We didn't confine the conversation just to what we owned. We really wanted to understand scoping and gathering materials as fully as possible. So again, what faculty were amassing on their own, and sometimes they were doing that because they came from places that didn't have a lot, or after working with us, some of them knew that they would be leaving Pitt, and they started, just in case, to pull some things together because they didn't want to be caught short. And sometimes it was digital items and links that they were doing, and people had them in a lot of places. Let's see. So we talked a little bit about accessibility. Sometimes digital had fewer barriers. You know, whatever the format, though, thoughtful curation was stated in interview after interview as really time consuming. And the need for it was really necessary prior to student use. Like, we cannot let the students just go in and go into this database and look around. Because of time constraints, they thought time was better spent on other aspects of learning. So it was this recognition of the need to scope, to introduce things, and then this accompanying recognition though of the value of students being able to skill up and do some of that navigation and sifting through. And you know, as these quotes make visible, that skill is something that should be offered, but it's trying to wedge it into a term. So, you know, we make it a little bit too easy for them. Then that process of, if they ever want to go and do independent research, they may not know where to start because we've already curated it for them. And somebody else said, you know, it's important to realize, what you can, that part of the process is actually being overwhelmed by material. How do you find it? So it's mastering being overwhelmed, and also that the wading through is the challenge. That there isn't necessarily a specific answer that you're going for. There's also the aspect that people talked about in, say, archives and collections about who gets to decide what's included. Is it a librarian? Is it an archivist? Is it some other kind of collector? Or if it's in a database or on a website, who's making those determinations? What are they calling things? How are they bundling them together? And what's the access like? And, you know, it was pointed out by several people that students now just see an overwhelming amount of information, and understanding about the creators and other things relating to the information getting to them is, you know, a really well worth looking at and understanding. There's the piece of learning that's tied to curation, that's understanding that there's not necessarily that right answer. And that the process of scoping materials and setting up assignments, you know, there's a distinction between spoon feeding and open discovery. Somebody likened it to, like, I wanted to create tasks that felt like and were real research, which means the outcomes aren't known. And one instructor likened it to not just burying bones for them to dig up, so it's not just this staged busy work. But again, getting to it is really hard. So to make the time to do. Somebody said it was like trying to clean your closet. Like, you know, you need to do it, and it'll be worth it, but just getting the time to get to it is really hard. So next slide, please. There are lots of opportunities. You know, curation is something that we naturally do. And in consultations, you know, we certainly talk and try to integrate. But for some next steps, maybe thinking about how to highlight the curation and discovery skills for students. And maybe look for not so much one-shots, but multiple visits over a term so that skills can be scaffolded. And we found that that is happening, but perhaps this will influence how we talk about that and maybe make it easier to have multiple visits there, you know, to really frame it as this will enable this development of skills. And then understanding what's already been gathered and who's gathering it, and perhaps look at opportunities to fold students into that curation experience. And, you know, there's online tools, there's lots of other ways I think that we could be doing that. It might be in exhibits, timeline projects, and the like, but that's putting the student in the role of creator and maybe making that light bulb go on there. Okay, the last step, or the last thing that I wanted to talk about, yeah, we can go. What we found was that critical analysis and context were vital. The other two things that I cited, you know, we got at that information, teased it out in a question or two, but in this area specifically, it just permeated the conversation. What's the goal? thinking skills, complex thinking skills. And, there's a concern that these students really don't have a lot of those skills. In any one class, when you look, you might have some students that really are able to think critically about things, but not everybody. So what we heard was that instructors really wanted to move students beyond the concept of giving the right answer to evidentiary inquiry and context. And similarly, or relatedly, what we heard was moving from opinion, or just here's my initial response to an item, to evidence-based analysis. So it also was called out as those kind of skills as life skills, right? It's not about this class. It's not about the college experience. It's valuable wherever it is that you're going. Next slide. I just really like this quote. So archives always have gaps. You're always having to do that work of historical reconstruction around whatever sources you find. And that can be really scary for undergraduates, because usually what they want is the formula by which they will succeed. So this mentions that whole formulaic learning and that overwhelming sense, and also that archives have gaps, which relates to a lot of things that are being looked at now with where are there silences in archives, who is determining how things are set up. So there's really a lot, I think, packed into this quote. Okay, next slide. So next steps. We're doing a lot of things, but as we move forward, whatever outputs we have, we want to be clear to draw a line to how those outputs relate to critical analysis skills. So it might be as simple as a discussion after a class. It might be an assignment with blog posts or essays, because a lot of times instructors give those. It could be digital humanities types assignments, like the group together working on a timeline. It could also be integrating things that weren't part of the formal visit to special collections or archives, where it might be integrated with course readings or with the lectures going on, or it might be integrating those things into secondary sources, which makes me think of like inviting liaisons into these conversations then too. So lots of ways to better support the learning process is really working as closely as possible with the instructor. Okay, so next slide, please. We have a lot of takeaways, so I tried to keep this short, but some of the things I think that we learned was that collaboration is an underpinning in all of this, and it's with the instructor, it's with our other colleagues. We understand that this methodology is pretty valuable. I think many of us are struggling with how do you make things tangible so that you can talk about them in terms of student learning and what it is that we do. So I think this is going to be transferable to other projects then too. We really were so happy with the team that we put together, because as Carrie mentioned, it's not just one unit, it's across units. And so yay that we did that. We also really thought it was valuable to work with colleagues from a lot of other institutions. And we're just starting to look at this data, but we think some stuff is transferable. So not only was there not a lot of formal training for using primary sources in classrooms, there probably wasn't a lot of training just in instruction. So some of this might be useful to our liaison colleagues. Yeah, or maybe we can combine with some other teams at some similar institutions and and continue conversations there. There are definitely some implications about online learning strategies. It's all about engagement and integration, and so there are some tools that we can look at there. Okay, so next slide, please. So as a general wrap-up, we know that we should build some training because it's a great big gap. We want to, we're sharing our findings with you, but we want to share our findings as we continue through this process and with a lot of different audiences, with humanities, but also maybe more specifically history and English and classics and liaisons and our Center for Teaching and Learning colleagues. We hope that this presentation will maybe inspire you to look at the ITHAKA S+R things, especially when the local reports are done and the national reports are out, and that maybe you'll look at additional studies. We think this was a really good way to get a handle on things, and that it will be foundational, that we're going to be able to build on this moving forward, and that it will open up the conversation to the people that we're not already talking to now. We're learning a lot, and it's all a good foundation to build on. So with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions now. So please feel free. I think we can all unmute. Well, not all of us, okay? All of us presenters in this can unmute. But please send your questions to the chat, and Jeanann, I think, is going to facilitate this.
And if you have questions about any of the process, whether it be our experience with ITHAKA S+R or the physical doing of the project.
Yeah. And if you don't have questions, but you have comments that relate to this, please let us know. Like I see one here from Amber while I was talking that was like, teach them to fish rather than giving them fish, basically. Yes, that is exactly it. And giving them these complex skills, because a lot of the resources that we use are tricky, and getting the historical context and wading through are big, it's a large process.
I understand that your goal is to develop some training materials for your faculty, but in the process of doing this research, did you discover that it generated a lot more requests for instruction help from the people that you were the faculty that you were engaging with? Did it turn into kind of class assignments or projects or not?
I think that there were people that we were already in good contact with, and I think with the timing of this, that for the other folks, it strengthened our contact with them. And so I think when we go back, it will in some cases lead to, oh, the library can do more, and look at that. I think COVID threw us a bit of a curve there and interrupted what that maybe that trajectory might look like. Yeah.
It definitely did get people who were not already using special collections, I think, aware of them then asking us what we had and us being able to tell them. So it broadened that perspective with them.
And I at the training, and then we talked about this before we started doing the interviews, some of us had questions about sticking to the script, because it's very easy to get very excited about things and then go off on a tangent. And a lot of times those tangents are, do you have this? Do you have that? What if we did this? And so what we chose to do was to say before we started taping, that if there are questions, like after the formal interview is over, then let's talk about all that stuff. And we certainly did have people who were, after talking together with us for, like that hour or so, we're still ready to talk about more specific things, because it was sparking a lot of ideas.
It's so often when we go into conversations with faculty members, that is our thought. It's like, how can we get them and their students in the library? This really kept us, as Claire said, more focused on what our interview protocol was, and it actually opened up so many more avenues for discussion and our learning in terms of understanding, what these folks think about, what informs their teaching, what their hopes are for their students. And even if you don't go through like a research protocol, just having those kinds of open-ended discussions with faculty colleagues is so illuminating.
I think
I'll add,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and I will also add that in doing the interviews, I had at least 2 interviewees indicate something to the effect that I didn't realize the library would be willing to do this or help me in this way, or I felt like I'd be kind of intrusive or imposing upon you. And I think that that's a challenge that all librarians and archivists face in our daily work. And I think that we are going to have to, hearing it again makes me wonder, how can we do better outreach about our services and the ways in which we can help our communities as well. After Claire, I have a question for the group. Go ahead, Claire.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead. Go for it.
So my question to the group is that I feel like, as my colleagues have said, we've learned so much about this study. Has anyone else in this group been a part of an ITHAKA S+R study or another multi-institutional study? And did some of the things that we went through resonate with you?
While some of you are thinking of this, I also see that there's a question in the chat. How do you translate this to the online environment rather than physical archives? And I know one of the things that someone said to me in the interview that I did, or that I read, is that they like the students having the opportunity to handle things, which is why they chose to get facsimiles of their own in their own curation and allow students to access them. So I think that's a good question for Claire and Jeanann. How do you translate something like this?
Well, and I think that there is a distinction to be made between a digital surrogate, right, where you just go to HathiTrust or something, there it is, and then some other means of interaction online. So it could be that you're using a document camera, or that you're doing a Zoom presentation, so that, like, I work with children's books, so you can see the scale of things, you can flip through pages. So there are different ways to engage, and we're looking at a lot of those. I know Jeanann and I and Diana at this point too, were going to a lot of webinars that Teaching with Primary Sources, with the RBMS and SAA groups are hosting, and it's all about not having it be merely digital surrogates, but more interaction type things. So we're continuing to look at that. I think that could be its own big webinar.
Yeah, that's just to add on to what Claire said, I think the Rare Book and Manuscript Society and the Society of American Archivists, they were on it immediately when universities started to shut down, and they had weekly Zoom meetings and people just demoing classes that they did or tools that they used to make primary sources accessible, available, and somehow integrate them into learning in an online environment. So we're still working on planning to use some of these different tools and activities of engagement in the fall term. You also, Amber mentioned a question about copyright. Most of the materials, many of the materials, not most, are in the public domain, so there is no copyright issue. And also a lot of the use that we're talking about would fall under fair use for instruction. We're not in any way, just, you know, it could be a facsimile that's targeted to a specific user group, so it's not necessarily being made available online unless we have the rights and permissions to do so. So there certainly can be copyright issues, but we're looking into that as we're making things available.
Yeah, and to fit with fair use for some things, for some instructors, I didn't talk about it much, but there was that ambivalence between like covering everything for this course and getting some depth by just really moving in close and looking at one item. And so the experience can still be a good one and not flag copyright things if you just look at a page or a poem or a snippet of something, but really dive in. And I think with us partnering, when those decisions are made, you know, it's a good way to support that evidentiary inquiry-based learning. And it's, you know, in some respects, some of the things that we're able to do best there. So I think that relates to some of the questions that people were raising.
Yeah, and I saw
in
Karen's
terms of an institution-wide survey, it looks like Karen Diaz from West Virginia University has, that they've also kind of harnessed those data, even if the survey is administered at the university level, keeping in good partnership and contact with your Office of Institutional Research can get you connected to those data that might be relevant to the library. So that's a really good point too.
We also look at the ITHAKA surveys too, but if you have the opportunity to look at something that's more focused, that's not one of their surveys, but an actual project that they're doing, I would recommend investigating that and seeing if you can have the funding to participate and to be involved.
I also want to mention, this is Veronica, from the institutional perspective. This project is one of the at least 4 that we have on the go at the moment within the university library system, where we're doing a work with the national or external organization. So we have 2 with ITHAKA S+R and we have 2 with ARL at the moment. And we see this as a great way to upskill our colleagues. So we have different teams working on those projects, but big components of those projects is training in qualitative research methods, in interview techniques, in collecting information, in analyzing that information. So, you know, from the assessment perspective, is getting as many colleagues involved in those and working on an actual project, which is probably not as daunting as trying to come up with own projects and own methodologies, but kind of getting these toes wet by working with something that is slightly more structured, but still giving a lot of insight into the process is extremely valuable.
And in doing, there's another project that some of us are involved in, as Bernica mentioned. It's with primary sources, and we're really looking at like the RBMS SAA guidelines for information literacy. So that's still, you know, in our brains there as we go through this stuff. And so it's really interesting how much of what's in the info literacy component is resonating through these interviews, right? Because it's about critical thinking skills. So even though it's arduous to be doing 2 big studies at the same time, that's one of the bonuses, I guess, is that there's some relational elements there to help us really fully understand some of the findings.
I think we're getting close to the noon hour, so I'm going to go to the contact information slide so you can see all of our contact information. And we welcome, I think every single one of us welcomes questions, comments, anything that you may have if you want to get in touch with us to talk more about this project or just about primary sources in education in general. We are open to taking those questions and comments.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming today. So be sure to check your email for the link to the recordings and the assessment form. The assessment form will be for the first presentation and the second presentation today. If you only attended this session, just fill out that part of it. And thank you again to everyone.